Welcome back to The Close Read, the official podcast of the Claremont Review of Books. I'm Spencer Clavin, Associate Editor here at the Claremont Institute, and every time we put out a new issue of the CRB, it is my privilege and pleasure to sit down with some of the authors and discuss what they've written in more depth. This is a special edition. It's particularly exciting because we are joined by Claremont Senior Fellow Glenn Ellmers. He has a storied career that I won't go into in great detail, but as I said, he's a senior fellow here. He's a visiting research scholar at Hillsdale College, and he's just come out with a new book, The Soul of Politics, which is a searching reflection upon, I hesitate to call it a biography or even an intellectual biography so much as a searching reflection, examination of the life and thought of Harry V. Jaffa, intellectual godfather of the Claremont Institute. But much more than that, as the book reveals. You can get it on Amazon, and you can also read an excerpt, or I suppose an essay, developed out of the book in the new CRB, summer 2021. It's called Why Harry V. Jaffa Matters. It's online. It should be in your mailbox. If you haven't checked already, go running out now to read it. This is a really lovely essay that helps present the consequences of Jaffa's thought, some of his insight into what would become our present crisis, far avant la lettre, long before others realized what kind of cold civil war we were in. And Glenn ties all of this together in an address to what we call the natural aristoi, that is the best and brightest, the true elites, you might say, of any regime, who always are there ready to fight for the cause, but who sometimes are made difficult to find, as in our degraded age, by a number of conflicting factors, which I think we'll get into as we talk with Glenn. I'm going to read a portion of this essay, and then we'll get into it. Glenn writes, Socrates first articulated the principle of natural right in the 5th century BC in response to the inadequacy of conventionalism and positivism, doctrines which held, as with the legal positivists of mentioned above, that law and justice lack any objective ground, existing only as the conventional preferences of a given society. Today's paleoconservatives never absorbed the lesson. When confronted by people who adhere to different customs and values, the defenders of tradition have no objective ground on which to settle disputes, leaving only recourse to passionate assertion or force. This is one feature of the tribalism into which the United States is now descending. Many paleoconservatives exhibit an almost willful animus toward the American founding, or at least some key founders, especially Thomas Jefferson, and documents, especially the Declaration of Independence. Despite their admirable patriotism, they stubbornly resist embracing the political theory of the Revolution, even in the face of compelling evidence. Jaffa, who modified his views in some important ways in response to Wilmore Kendall's arguments, showed that the framers were not abstract theoreticians, but practical statesmen. Even the Declaration, which disqualifies savages and barbarians from self-government, is pragmatic about the moral and cultural conditions necessary for republicanism. Glenn, great to have you on the show. Welcome and congratulations on the publication of the book.
Thank you, Spencer. It's always wonderful to talk with you and my good friends at the Claremont Institute. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, and likewise. This is a book that you've addressed to our own aristoi, to the young or young at heart of our generation, who, as we sometimes say, know what time it is, who see how deeply the American regime has sort of collapsed into crisis, and who don't embrace quietism, who think that it's still worth fighting for America, who want to do something about it, and who you believe can benefit profoundly from becoming acquainted, if they're not already, with Harry Jaffa. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us? Why Jaffa? Why now for our aristoi?
Sure. So one way to put this is, how does that old saying go? Errors are multiple, but the truth is singular. And so in response to the crisis of our time, there's a lot of different ways to go wrong. And you mentioned quietism is one, a descent into a kind of Nietzschean rejection of politics is another. a withdrawal into some sort of religious community. There's a certain strand of Catholicism now, so there's various ways that I think are anti-political or unpolitical, and in various ways unhelpful in responding to this. And what I want to do is show, at least make the argument for Jaffa's position that politics always matters. And indeed, I would even say to those younger people who are especially disaffected with clown world and are tempted to become cynical or unpolitical, a reminder that the greatest human achievement, if you want to be truly magnanimous, if you really want to demonstrate your virtue, your strength, your thumos, your spiritedness, the greatest field of action is politics, and the greatest statesmen have emerged in times of crisis. And so in a way, this is actually, I hate to quote that horrible man who said, never let a crisis go to waste, but there's a more benign or noble way of looking at that. And that is that times of crisis call on the best of men to achieve great things. And that's a much better way of looking at what we're going through now, it seems to me.
Yeah, you make reference there to something which we've been pretty concerned with at Claremont, and I think we've been in some respects leaders in the think tank set of paying attention to the very online right. I mean, this is especially true. We're running a feature right now as we do this recording at the American Mind of responses to your book and to the themes it raises. And I think we get into that there, but perhaps less so in the CRB, generally speaking. And so for listeners to this show, I mean, there's an incredible fragmentation, I think, among people who would be candidates for this position of natural aristoi. And you've suggested some of the different camps into which people fall, right? There's the Catholic integralists, there's the right-wing bodybuilders who think that they'll be saved by like lifting weights, and all respect to lifting weights. You and I both love doing that, but you're suggesting, I think, that there's something missing from all of these approaches. And I wonder whether, in your experience, you've had success with or have some suggestions for kind of reaching out in that digital space, because it's a new medium. It causes fragmentation in some ways. It encourages people to kind of silo off into these bubbles and abstract away from the world. How does one, as they say, reach the youth with a book with some kind of call to action in real life?
Well, one way is it just to tell the story of who Jaffa was and what he did. I mean, in a way, he's his own best. He's the best argument for himself, simply by what he said and what he did. People don't realize that he was himself an athlete. He was a boxer at Yale. He ended up giving up boxing after his freshman year. It didn't quite work out for him, but he remained, very much interested in physical fitness and health. He was a long distance cyclist. He was a pugilist in the physical sense at Yale, but remained a pugilist in the intellectual or philosophical sense throughout his whole life. Very spirited, very political, and I want to show both by his example and by his teaching that to reject the again, not all of your readers will know these references, but to reject what some young people on the right called the bug man life, right? The low, the cubicle life of the establishment obedient sheep doesn't mean that you have to turn to Nietzsche. It doesn't mean that you have to turn away from politics. What I really wanted to show with Jaffa is that there is a noble, spirited, enticing alternative that involves engaging with politics, not turning away from politics. And again, that times of crisis really provide a field for great human achievement. And so this can be seen really as an opportunity for people who want to demonstrate their own individual excellence, as it were.
I want to make a comment on something you just said, and then I have a question about the pugilism. Probably the most notorious aspect of Jaffa's career and relevant also to the kind of contemporary issues we're talking through here. My comment is just that, one of the more effective modes of engagement that I've noticed among kind of young dissident conservatives who, as you say, are adopting all of these different ways of dealing with the fact that the institutions are corrupt, the fact that they feel like they're being shunted into this meaningless life, is the recovery of sort of the great man biography, right? The biography of the statesman who is not just a brain in a jar, who maybe triumphs in war, who certainly trains his body and his mind, and the recovery you're suggesting, I think, of politics as the venue for that whole person, for somebody that is a man or indeed a woman from top to bottom, and I think like you're presenting a kind of Plutarchian approach to Jaffa, but to politics more generally. That the stories about great men, true stories about great men, are an actually more suitable way to deal with some of the problems that the very online right is dealing with. My question is about the fighting, and this is, as I said, a notorious element of Jaffa's personality, of his career. As you mentioned in the book, William F. Buckley famously wrote, if you think it's hard arguing with Harry Jaffa, try agreeing with him. And I think it seems to me that everybody who knew him kind of grasped or experienced this element of him. He was extremely polemical. And that, of course, is also a feature of online discourse, of opponing the libs, of quote tweeting, of any number of other things you might use to describe the way that we are really getting scrappy in our political discourse. A feature, of course, of fundamental disagreements, and something that I think vexes a lot of people about this approach is does it really persuade anybody? And the kind of blunt way of putting this is oh, shouldn't we be nicer? And I wonder what your response is to that, and your take on how effective Jaffa's confrontational approach was.
Right. Well, he was confrontational. So first of all, just to back up, just to provide some context, Jaffa was a wonderfully kind person, one-on-one, a very giving person in the classroom, would never have dreamed of embarrassing or humiliating a student in the classroom, was very generous with his time. He really reserved his artillery fire for other intellectuals and political figures who were in the public arena and could presumably take it and fight back. And I think that's a reasonable assumption. He also thought that it's possible to have these intellectual, political, philosophical disagreements without it becoming personal. Now, other people often did take it personally, and Jaffa, I think, to his great credit, tried not to, and usually often did not take it personally. He always said that, just because we disagree about something doesn't mean we have to. And he made, he lost some friends, some people he disagreed with very vehemently. He did remain friends with. He and Mel Bradford, who was, a somewhat egregious neo-Confederate, which is certainly something Jaffa objected to philosophically and morally, and yet they remained cordial. He was good friends with Wilmore Kendall, and they went at it hammer and tongs. And he was also quite practical. He strenuously opposed Robert Bork's jurisprudence, and yet he supported Bork. His nomination to the Supreme Court. He even sent in a little money to sort of a fund to promote him. He supported Mel Bradford's nomination to the National Endowment for the Humanities. And so he didn't let these disagreements get in the way of personal friendship, if the other person was willing, or practical judgments about what was useful politically. So that's an important context.
Yeah, that sort of prudentialist aspect of when to take up the sword and shield and when to put them down. It's almost an appealingly sort of parliamentary approach to political disputes, right? I mean, you watch parliamentary debates in Britain, and you think that they're about to come to blows, and then of course they all go out to the pub afterwards. At least this is how it used to be. I don't know if it's still the case, right. But yeah, I mean, I want to ask you about this kind of coalition building element of this, because it does seem to me as if our problem on the right is not so much that we're too mean or whatever, but that we can become ideological purists. And you get into this in some detail in your essay in CRB, and of course in more detail in the book, the kinds of intra-conservative disagreements that Jaffa was navigating between paleocons and National Review and kind of, the Southern agrarians versus neoliberals or whatever you want to call it. And I think now we have similar but quite different debates going on, raging on the right, and something is going to happen, or maybe even is in process, where we're negotiating between all those different camps that we just talked about. I wonder what your thought is about what that coalition is going to look like or is looking like? I mean, who gets to come to the table? Who's kind of on our side? And what are some of the remaining disagreements to be worked out if we're going to, win elections and stuff?
Right. So the long excerpt you read from was specifically about the paleoconservatives. And what's interesting there is, in a way, they commit a serious or a couple of serious intellectual errors. And yet, on the practical level, I think they're potentially, and somewhat, in some cases are, and in some cases potentially are, our best allies. And by us, I mean the Claremont School, in the sense that they know what the problem is, what time it is,
Yeah.
as you're fond of saying. They certainly see the crisis of the regime. They certainly appreciate the moral aspect of it, the connection between morality and politics, virtue and happiness, as Washington said. And so, in a way, they're pretty far along in being allies. And I think me and people like Mike Anton and other people at the Claremont Institute have tried to reach out and show that on some levels there's not as much disagreement as might be thought, and to encourage practical unity where possible in the face of what I think all of us agree is a common opponent of the radical woke leftist agenda, which would absolutely and utterly transform the regime into something no one on the right wants. And surely we should all come together in the face of that.
Mm-hmm.
The other sort of the mirror image that I discuss a little bit in the essay and in the book are the East Coast Straussians, who see some of the intellectual issues more clearly, but are less reliable on what you might call the moral political ground. And then, in a way, the problem with them is just the opposite. And in a way, they're less reliable, even though they understand natural right, they understand the tensions between the philosopher and the city and all of these catchphrases. But it demonstrates something that Jaffa talked about all the time, that he gets from Aristotle and that I talk about in the book, is there's a distinction between moral and intellectual virtue, right? And you can be wise in a theoretical way and quite imprudent on a practical level. And navigating all of that and working all that out and trying to build alliances where possible are some of the things that I hint at. I mean, I don't have a 30-point agenda for how to save the country. No one could do that. But I do try to point to many of these things and lay out what Jaffa has to say about these things in a way that I think is very helpful for those of us who are trying to find a practical path forward. How to use prudence and moral reasoning in the face of a practical dilemma, and also see the intellectual and theoretical elements that informs, and that we need. Again, theory and practice are distinct, but they are not alien to each other. And so we need the theory, we need the philosophy in order to understand where we're going.
Right.
But then the practical level is its own dimension.
Well, right. So, okay, in the time that remains to us, I want to ask you, I think, a pretty practical question, actually, about the bad guys and their relationship to the Aristoi, right? I mean, you've identified what is becoming an increasingly clear opponent for anybody that wants seriously to rescue the American regime, and that is this kind of monoparty conglomerate of ruling class oligarchs. And I resist using the phrase elites about them, because I mean that sort of suggests, right, that they actually deserve their place, that there's some sort of meritocratic process going on whereby they gain their positions of power. And I think we're no longer in a position where that's even remotely true. And I was talking just last night actually with my buddy Michael Knowles, whom you know and people will know. He and I go way back. We went to school together. And, we were talking about our experience of the Ivy Leagues in the 21st century. And our experience was essentially that we both came out less self-controlled, less psychologically balanced, and less able to deal with life, the world, and our souls than we had come in. Because the whole structure of the social institution, at least, whatever good classes we took, whatever, and we did, we learned many wonderful things, had many wonderful teachers, but already at that time, the social structure of the institution was turning in such a way as to essentially deform people that had been identified as the best and the brightest. So there's this system now where you take the cream of the crop and then you basically unmake them psychologically. It's a very devious way to go at a regime. And this is an ancient truth, as you well know, of political philosophy, that if you want a healthy regime, you got to identify your elites, you got to train them up, and then you've got to shape their souls in such a way that they'll form a regime for the good. And it seems to me that one of the most devious things that our ruling class currently does is they zero in on those people who would otherwise be good candidates for, Aristoi status, and basically, weaponize them to their own purposes, which means debilitating them psychologically. Is there something to that, first of all? And if so, how do we intervene in that treadmill? That is, how do we find the people whom you've addressed in this book and really kind of invite them into a better, healthier way of doing politics?
Yeah, boy, that's a big challenge. I mean, I think a lot of the things that the Claremont Institute is doing are helpful for that. The fellowship programs keep expanding. When I was there, it was just the Publius Fellows program a few decades ago, and now it's expanded more and more. Bringing people in, giving them providing them some alternative to the corrupt elite institutions. Other outposts are there. But yeah, I mean, this is the challenge. Jaffa spent a lot of time thinking about and teaching the Nicomachean ethics, and that is about habituation and how early education, especially early education of the young, shapes. It's really determinative of how the regime will unfold. And so, we have to get these younger people. I mean, it's funny, the experience you described is in a way the antithesis of the Nicomachean ethics. You were sort of dehabituated
exactly.
from the classical virtues, right? You had the classical virtues habituated out of you, and that's a tremendous challenge. It's really why the Claremont Institute was founded 40 years ago, and what it continues to do. But I'm afraid I don't have a pat, one sentence answer to how to fix that.
No, well, I wouldn't expect you to, but I do remark upon one element of, one of the respondents in the feature that we're doing over at the American Mind is Ken Masugi, a former student of Jaffa's, as well as a number of other great Straussians, and then later went on to work with Clarence Thomas, now Supreme Court Justice. And one of the great observations in that piece is that Jaffa really doesn't come across as the sort of college professor who's always, making these gestures of outreach toward his students. His students emerge with this enormous warmth toward him and gratitude for his teaching, but he's prickly. He's making all of these kind of weird recommendations that the students don't always fully understand until many years later. And this is, it seems to me, a kind of a lost art among teachers, right? That, now with student evaluations and everything, the thing to be is the cool professor who is immediately digestible, lovable, accessible. The Jaffa that emerges from your book isn't really like that at all. It goes on these endless sort of tangents, and people emerge hours after the seminar was supposed to end. They're remarkable stories about him. Is that experience, I mean, perhaps that kind of experience is now only to be found in say, a Claremont Fellowship. I don't know whether you think that is kind of a lost art that we can recover from Jaffa, or am I missing something that made him more appealing than he initially seems?
Well, it's a lost art partly because we've given into this idea that the young, the unformed, and the unhabituated should teach the old, the formed, and the habituated, which is happens upside down. The other thing is Jaffa knew enough to be confident in his convictions. He didn't hesitate to think that he knew more than his students, and was prepared to show them that. And in fact, if they were patient enough to listen to him, and by the way, even as a graduate student, I sometimes wasn't patient enough to listen to him.
Right.
But it paid off because he really did know what he was talking about. And so part of the problem on the right now is that we've lost the courage of our convictions, that we actually think we have something to teach to these young people. That's another problem.
That is a remarkable point, that sort of steel in the spine that enables you to, for example, just as a hypothetical off the top of my head, to stand in a Yale courtyard and stare down a screaming group of students that is crying at you about Halloween costumes, right? And where, just to close, where do you think Jaffa got that? Was it just more a product of his time? But he seems to have been remarkable in this respect, that courage.
Yeah, it's partly innate temperament. Partly, he grew up in a different, he was born in 1918. He was a Jew in New York. I tell a little story about how his mother dressed him in sort of a fancy outfit when he was quite young, and he got beat up in the schoolyard by the other boys. I mean, that sort of stuff just doesn't happen anymore. And so it was sort of a different America where you just sort of had to be tough, a little bit tougher just to survive. Especially as a Jew in New York in those days. But partly it's temperament. Partly it's because we're also obsessed with being nice, but it's a superficial niceness that covers over what in fact is a very nasty and vindictive element in our politics now. And so what we should do is be less nice and pursue less niceness and more civic friendship, which doesn't require that we be nice to each other, but that we respect each other and respect each other's rights. And that would be a much more useful attitude.
Indeed. And that we strive to be good, I suppose, right? I mean, niceness.
Well, on the individual level is to strive for virtue and excellence. Yes, absolutely.
Right. Well, once more, the essay in CRB is called Why Harry v. Jaffa Matters. I'm going to read another paragraph from it, and then I'm going to tell you once again to buy this book because it really is a wonderful achievement. Just to close us out, Jaffa anticipated and answered decades ago many of the current criticisms of America. He showed that an effective defense of the American regime had to refute the stolid paleos and traditionalists who have no use for natural rights theory, and the cloud-dwelling scholars who disdain political life on the ground. Even conservatives who don't consider themselves opposed to the Declaration tended, Jaffa thought, to be ignorant of or alienated from its ideas and from the founding principles more generally. This failure remains a problem for virtually the entire conservative establishment. Well, for some suggestions how to solve that problem and for a really wonderful read, go wherever books are sold and get The Soul of Politics by Glenn Ellmers. Glenn, it's a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Spencer. It was great.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Close Read, a Claremont Review of Books podcast and a production of the Claremont Institute. Our publisher is Ryan Williams. Our producer is Jake Gannon, and I'm your host, Spencer Clavin. Thanks to Benjamin Squiret for our music. If you liked this episode and you'd like to hear more in-depth interviews based on the Claremont Review of Books, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on all major platforms. And if you'd like to support us, we encourage you to leave a 5-star review on iTunes. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you again next time.